Well, it's a real joy to be with you this morning, and in particular to work through one of my very favorite preaching schedules of the year as we go through this Advent time, this focus on the coming of Christ. And so this morning we take a break from our Mark series and we look to what it means to wait on Jesus. Now, just to distinguish this before we begin, we tend to think of Christmas as a day, but it's actually a season in the church. And there's a time before Christmas, which we call Advent, and that's the coming of Christ, where we recognize that, think about that. And then there's a time after Christmas. Now, you may have thought the 12 days of Christmas are like the 12 days before Christmas, but they're not. The 12 days after Christmas are the 12 days of Christmas, right? So you have Advent, and then you have Christmastide. You have this whole season of celebrating Jesus' approach and his being here among us. So we do this as a sense memory kind of thing, that we need to rehearse these truths. The same way that you might sit down and have a nice anniversary dinner and tell each other stories and remember the good things. Advent is the same way. We rehearse our hope that we have in Jesus and our gratitude for his coming. So this morning we're going to do that in the first of four sermons that are focused on the questions that come about as a result of this season and the way that Christmas answers those questions. 4 questions about what it means for God to save the world through this time of Christ's coming into the earth and culminating in his death and resurrection. So we're going to look at that today, starting with a question of really how God is going to save a world that is violent. How does God save a violent world? Christmas belongs to sufferers. When I was a kid, and I used to sleep under the Christmas tree. By the way, did anybody else do this? Was this just a me thing? Please raise your hand if you did this from time to time, please. Thank you. There's 1 or 2 people, okay? I told my kids about this last night or the night before, and they were like, what? Why would you do this, right? And I don't know what it was. It was the being able to look up at the tree from underneath and seeing all the branches, and it was like you were outside. I have no idea, okay? Maybe I was a weird kid. But as you do these kinds of things and you consider what exactly is this season about, it has a real pull on our hearts. And it's easy to think that Christmas is about the happiest people being more happy. It's easy to think that Christmas is about vague notions of warmth and light. But something that I've always appreciated about Advent and about the story of Christ coming into the world was that it speaks to the part of us that deeply needs him to be here. Not just the joy that he's come, but the fact that we need him to come. Christmas is for sufferers. It belongs to them. And since all of us are sufferers, of one way, shape, or form, it belongs to us. This first promise of that we're going to examine comes from the book of Isaiah. And when I read it in a moment, you'll catch the very end of it, but you might not catch the very beginning of it. It might seem strange to you. Christianity describes Christmas in different ways. The book of Luke talks about it as if it's truth in a world of skepticism. John talks about Christmas as if it's light in a world of darkness. Mark skips over it completely because he wants to get on to the next big thing. The book of Luke, right? The book of John, the book of Mark, but then the book of Matthew. The book of Matthew talks about Christmas in an interesting way. It talks about it as a consolation. It gives us a long list of people who lived in a different time, who had different needs. All of them, Matthew puts in this context of saying they were waiting for Jesus to be born. All of them sufferers in one way, shape, or form. They were waiting for Jesus. So we're going to look at that. We're going to talk about what it means for Christmas to be the answer for 4 questions about the saving of the world. How's God going to save a violent world, a lonely world, a divided world, and an unjust world? Christmas is a big answer to those questions. From Isaiah chapter 7, let me read it for you. This is written nearly 800 years before the birth of Christ. Again, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, "Ask a sign of the Lord your God. Let it be as deep as Sheol or as high as heaven." But Ahaz said, "I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test." And he said, "Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign," and then you're going to recognize this. "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." So before we read these words from the book of Matthew, they are the words of Isaiah. And in the book of Isaiah, Ahaz, just to give you a little bit of a setting, a king in the southern kingdom, and he is, at this point, considering allying with the nation of Assyria. Assyria was well known as quite possibly the most violent empire on the face of the earth. Some of their tortures, their ways of dealing with other countries, other nations, conquered armies, I mean, it still makes the skin crawl if you read the stories. I don't recommend you doing it. But Ahaz has an opportunity to say, "No, I'm going to trust the Lord," but instead he says, "Well, no, I'll make this alliance with Assyria." And God says, "Look, I'm willing to give you any sign at all that you want." And Ahaz has this moment where he says, "Well, I don't want to test the Lord," which is really his clever way of getting out of things. And then the Lord says, "Well, I'm going to give you a sign myself." So he takes this question, and Ahaz is asking about, how is my empire going to survive the violent age that we live in? How am I going to survive this? And God says, "I'll tell you how. The virgin will give birth, and he, the son, will be called Emmanuel." So you might ask, why are we starting with something 800 years before the birth of Christ? Why does it matter? And my answer to you is this. All of us, each one of us, live in a very violent world. Now, there are big picture violent things. We all know about them. The things that are on the news. The National Guardsmen being shot. The awful things that happen day in and day out in our neck of the woods. The things that happen around the world. But I also want to talk about the small violences. And I call them small not because they aren't significant, but because we don't often think about them this way. Violent things that we experience, just us, ourselves. The little bloodied that we get day in and day out. The person who says the cruel word to us. The one that we trust that withholds their love. The boss who tells us that we're irrelevant or unneeded. The culture that tells us we're not beautiful enough, fit enough, smart enough to make it. All the little violences that we experience on a day-to-day basis. That's the reason why I think it's important for us to see from the eyes of Isaiah and the eyes of Matthew why we need to hear about a virgin giving birth to a son and why we need to know his name. So we're going to talk this morning about the way that Jesus responds to a violent world, or the way that Christmas is a response. And it's a response this way, because we tend to think there are two options for how we live in a world where we get cut all the time. Those two options we tend to think are be innocent, more innocent than they are. Be more pure, be more good. All right? And if you're good, if you're pure, if you're righteous, then you can save the world. And the other side of it is those of us who say, yeah, that's a plan, but also, what if we just be more violent than they are? What if we be tougher? What if we be craftier? What if, instead of getting hurt, we make sure we hurt them first? Too innocent or too violent? Jesus coming to earth shows us that he is both more innocent and more violent than we are. I'm going to explain how. But first, how is he more innocent than we are? Well, the virgin shall conceive. This detail, it's intended to help us understand something really interesting about the line of Christ, which is that Jesus, in the line of Christ, is not going to be twisted and distorted as every other human being is, all right? So the clarity about the fact that he's going to be born in this way is not just to say it's miraculous, but to say this is a different kind of human being, all right? A different kind of human being. He's not going to carry original sin the way that everybody else does. He's not going to struggle with the same things, but he's going to walk in our flesh. So we're hearing this immediately. He's going to be more innocent than we are, right? Now that view of human beings as being born into sin, being born sinful, it's not very popular in our day and time. By the way, I just recognized I'm holding Laura's coffee mug. Mama needs coffee. So not as manly as my normal mug, but anyway, Mama needs coffee, and so does Dad. Okay, so more innocent than we are. It's not a view we like. If you've seen Wicked 1 or 2, Wicked or Wicked for Good, I haven't seen the second one, and I've seen most of the first one, but more importantly, I saw the thing that it was based on, The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz is like the quintessential secular humanist story. And what I mean by that is that it's the story of how you and I can be trusted to find the light within ourselves to save the world. That in essence, human beings we're essentially good. And so the thing that we struggle with is just not being us, right? If only people could see what's inside, and you know how musicals are, right? Wicked is the musical and movie based on the other movie and the other story. But here's how musicals work, right? Things are grim, and then suddenly someone has a song. You know what I mean? And the song turns everything around. And you're watching, and the cinematography, everyone tells you, you're about to see this person become beautiful and good and innocent and righteous, right? Everything in the story is telling you it's within you. The story of the Wizard of Oz, right? Well, you were smart all the time. You were brave all the time. You just didn't know it. So this picture of humanity as being innocent says, look, if you live in a violent world, all you have to do is just be better. Be you. Be righteous. Be less selfish. Be less greedy. Okay. Well, that's one way to do it. But the problem with that is that it presumes that within us is not just the innocence, but the violence that happens. That somehow, if all of us are really essentially good, and we all just need to look inside of ourselves, then what about the person that looks inside of themselves and says, you know what, I want to be me, and that's why I'm going to steal? What about the person that says, well, you be you, and I'm going to be me, and when I'm me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rob you? What about the person that says, you be you, and that's fine, I'm going to be me, and I'm going to crush you because it'll make me feel better? The problem with this humanistic view of things, the idea that we can be good enough, we can be innocent enough, is that it fails over and over again. Human history is this story, right? Right before World War I, there was this great invention. The study of pneumatics had helped us understand how to create even a breathable lung for people who were hurt, ailing, who were in danger of dying. They learned this ability to use air in a way that could save lives. They also discovered that you can use that same science to create a repeating rifle and to mow people down in the trenches. Human beings are the story of being both the answer to and the cause of all the world's problems. This is what we do. So how is all of this going to work if human beings are both responsible for and in some ways unable to cure what's wrong? What do we do? I think of David Sedaris, who tells the story about visiting Anne Frank's house. And he goes and he visits Anne Frank's house, and he has the normal human emotions of that process. And he's looking and he's wondering, how could people be so evil? How could the Holocaust have even happened? How could people have this kind of way of treating one another? And then as he's going through the house, he starts to realize, gosh, this is a beautiful home. And it sure would be great to own a home like this, right? He's going through, and at the end of his time in Anne Frank's house, he starts to think, gosh, It's a real shame that this thing is a museum now, because can you imagine what you could get for this on the open market, right? And then he says, as he's looking through this beautiful picture window, he sees a reflection of himself. And he recognizes how dark his heart is. And then he says, and past my reflection, I saw a flat across the street that was probably in my price range. He was just attacked by the sense of his own guilt and recognizing that even when he thought he understood it, there were more levels of deception underneath. This is why we need Emmanuel. This is the reason why we need somebody who's more innocent than we are. The Yale theologian Miroslav Volf, he was born in Croatia, he grew up in Serbia. His understanding of Christian theology was shaped by that war from the 90s. The Bosnian War. He lectured on an orthodox view of Christian theology, and he did that while atrocities were being committed in his own country. It's really an incredible way to learn how to be a Christian, right? In the middle of war. And he wrestled with this fact that human beings have such an elevated view of our own innocence, our own capacity to do good things. And here's what he said about it. He said, if you try to see humanity as the answer to our problems, he said, you would discover that it takes the quiet of a suburban home for the birth of that thesis that human nonviolence corresponds to God's refusal to judge. And he says this, and this is what caught me. In a scorched land soaked in the blood of the innocent, it will invariably die. In other words, his point was, hoping in innocence and being good is a luxury that not everyone in the world has. That people around the world often see the darkness of human nature. We need something more than us. So here's this promise. The promise is there's going to be an innocent born into the world, and it will be God himself. Someone who is better, purer. And that one is going to be born. God's response to our lesser innocence is to give himself. You and I who are breaking our backs trying to be good, God's going to be the good one. It's the reason why, if you're a fan of the minor key Christmas carols, so many of them talk about oppression and struggle and hurt and brokenness. And one of my favorite Christmas carols, in his name, all oppression shall cease. Not in my name, but in his. So God has to be more innocent than me. And so when I see that Jesus is going to be born in this way, he's not going to be in the same way a human being that I am. He's going to be more than that. He's going to be both God and man. He's not going to be a sinner in the way that I'm a sinner. He's not going to carry that original sin with him. He's going to be different. We also see, though, that God must be not just more innocent, but more violent than we are. So the promise is the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. In other words, she will conceive and bear a human being. Now, that may not seem like an earth-shattering idea. We've all heard it, but I want to ask you something that I ask every Advent. I'm going to ask you again. Why was Jesus born a human being? Because only human beings can bleed. That's the reason. Flesh bleeds. So Jesus is born in the flesh. Only the flesh can bleed. I want to draw your attention to Ephesians chapter 2 for a second. The first 3 verses, they're an indictment on wrath and violence that plagues humanity. And so what happens is this child who is born into the world, God-man, in the flesh, is then carried through kind of human history, becomes the Lamb himself, takes on human sin, goes to the cross, and then Paul, sometime later, writing in the book of Ephesians, talks about all the violence of human beings. And then he says, but God, being rich in mercy because of the great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved. So Paul's starting to build up to something, right? He's talking about all the wrath of human beings, the brokenness of them. And then as he moves down, he gets somewhere in verse 16. before that, let me read you something. Frederick Buechner, in talking about deadly sins, he said this: of the 7 deadly sins, anger is probably the most fun. Right? Most fun. He said, to lick your wounds, to smack your lips over grievances long past, to roll over your tongue the prospect of bitter confrontation still to come, to savor the last toothsome morsel, both of the pain you are given and the pain you are giving back. In many ways, he says, it is a meal, a feast fit for a king. But the drawback, the chief drawback is that what you are wolfing down is yourself. The skeleton at the feast is you. The reason why we need Jesus to be born in the flesh, the reason why we need Jesus to bleed, is because you and I are not capable of paying the price ourselves. For everything that we are capable of doing, all the evil, all the brokenness, Christmas celebrates the fact that God said, I will bleed for you. I will be more violent than your violence. I will suffer what you can't suffer. When we see, Christmas comes and some of you might have mangers sitting around, and maybe you've got like other themes for your mangers, who knows? But you've got Jesus there, and some of us, because we're real nerds, take like the wise men and we actually put them in another part of the house because they weren't there when Jesus was born. They were there like 2 years later, right? And they slowly make their way. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. But the point is, as you have your pictures of Jesus, as you're sitting in that story, it is very important that you see that as you look at Jesus, you see the acknowledgement that you need someone who can be more violent than your violence. And it is God's commitment to do something very important. It is God's determination to move violence away from humanity and toward himself. That is the story. If you struggle and you say, this suffering, when is it going to end? All this brokenness, when is it going to stop? When am I going to stop doing what I do? When am I going to stop experiencing what I experience? You say, what in the world's going to happen? As you look at Jesus, you see God's determination to say, I will move the violence away from you and toward myself. That's what Christmas is about. There is no God, there is no religion more serious about the problem of evil in the world. You go home and you cry yourself to sleep. There is no God who's proven himself more than the God who is that violent toward himself for our sakes. The Bhagavad Gita is how Hinduism deals with God's very difficult character traits. How is he both loving and wrathful? How is he judge and sacrifice? How is it possible for him to do these things in a broken world? And so they just divide up the gods into just many others, right? The incredible thing about the Christian story is that we see God's commitment to hold all of those things together. He will be both the most loving God possible and the most grieving God possible. The most lovely and righteous God possible, while also being the most suffering God possible. It blows our minds to think about the way that God is capable of being all these things at once. And so at the very end of this promise, you're going to have God show up through this birth, this immaculate birth, this birth of sinlessness into the world. This child will be born of a virgin and will not carry with him the sin nature. And at the end, he says, and his name will be this, his name will be Emmanuel, which means God with us. So that's the last thing I want to say. A God not only who's more innocent and more violent, but a God who does this in order to be present with his people. You and I come to church during this time of year, during this season, and you may very well think, I brought myself to church today. But in the sovereignty of God, what I can tell you is that he brought you. What I can tell you is that he is drawing you. That if you have a sense somehow that God is speaking, that there's something going on in you, that you need to be here, that you need to observe his birth, that you need to think. I want to tell you why. It's because he is drawing you to himself. The story of Christianity is the story of God moving violence off of humanity and toward himself by being with us. By being with us. What does it mean then? How does this begin to change things? Well, if he is Emmanuel, then what I want to tell you this morning is that we need to learn how to suffer differently. The end of violence is that it causes suffering. So what do we do with that? With a God who is more innocent and more violent than we are, what do we do with that? We learn how to suffer differently. And here's what we do. We must learn to join Jesus in our suffering. What I mean by that is not that Jesus has gone away from us, but that as you suffer, you must recognize that you do not suffer alone. That the story of Christ coming to earth into a violent place is to say that you who belong to him will never, ever suffer alone. If he's with us, he suffers what we suffer. He suffers our griefs. He suffers the brokenness of things. He suffers them to an even deeper level than you and I possibly can. We must join him in our suffering. And here's the reason why. Because he is already suffering it. You may be trying to hide it, to bury it in entertainment, in eating and drinking, in living your life sexually, however you may choose. You may be seeking to cover it up and all of those different kinds of things. But Jesus himself is suffering and continues to grieve over the brokenness of the world, including yours and mine. Nicholas Wolterstorff, his 25-year-old son, died in a mountain climbing accident. He's a theologian who writes about the suffering of the son in a book called Lament for a Son. And he talks about what it looked like for him to learn how to suffer differently. And here's what he learned. As he was talking to God, he was writing it this way: "How is faith to endure, O God, when you allow all this scraping and tearing on us?" So you who are suffering, in particular right now, I want you to think about this. You have allowed rivers of blood to flow, mountains of suffering to pile up, sobs to become humanity's song, all without lifting a finger that we could see. If you've not abandoned us, explain yourself. We strain to hear, but instead of hearing an answer, we catch sight of God himself scraped and torn. Through our tears, we see the tears of God. A new and more disturbing question now arises. Why do you permit yourself to suffer, O God? Why do you not grasp joy? So the piece of this I want you to understand. Jesus has suffered once and for all for our sins on the cross. But your God loves you so much that he cannot help but grieve the brokenness that you experience. To suffer well is part of what we learn at Christmas as we see Jesus born into the world as a propitiation for our sins, as a consolation for our griefs. And to suffer well is this. We may start by saying, God, how can you let me suffer this way? When is this going to end? I want you to move to, oh Lord, how are you letting us suffer this way? How would you allow us to grieve this way? When is it going to be over? It's critically important that we understand God's co-suffering with his people. You are not alone. Emmanuel is God with us at all times. Not just in good times, but in the hard times. And until he returns again, God is with us to suffer with us. And we must learn to join him in our suffering.